on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The internet tells us that Albert Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. The internet is wrong. Albert Einstein did not say that. He's too smart to say something as cliched as that. But there's an element of truth to whichever online pundit did come up with it, in that when you try a tactic over and over, a way of managing something, if it keeps breaking, at a certain point, you've got to kind of ask yourself, well, if this thing keeps breaking, is it just never going to work right? And that, I suppose, is one way to approach my conversation with my next guest. Richard Wolff is someone I always enjoy speaking with. He is, as you know, the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He's an economist and economic historian. His latest book is The Sickness is the System. I think at this point I know his biography better than my own. And he's been thinking specifically about this thing we have called regulation. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome to the program.
Thank you, RJ. As usual, very glad to be here.
So let's start with this. We've seen in the news lately, first of all, the suffering people of Palestine. That's something we've seen for a long time, but in this case, it's East Palestine, Ohio, as opposed to the Midwest, Middle East instead of the Midwest. So East Palestine, Ohio, where there was a tragic train crash, release of toxic chemicals. Now we're learning a lot from my colleague David Sirota and his publication, among others, about the lobbying that's been done to ease restrictions. Much of it done by Norfolk Southern, which was operating this train. We had the catastrophe of crypto, and in last week's show, we did an episode on your colleague Larry Summers and his, intimate role in the sort of purveying of crypto. And it all seems to come back to, there are two interpretations. One is that regulations don't work, which I would say is what conservatives normally say. So let's not regulate. That's their conclusion. And others who say, well, they'll work. We just don't have the right people. But if Joe Biden hasn't appointed the right people, if Barack Obama didn't appoint the right people, Bill Clinton didn't appoint the right people, we're not talking about Republicans. We're just talking about 50 years of breakdowns in the regulatory process. So what exactly is going wrong that we have to deal with these same issues over and over again?
Well, I think there's a very, very important lesson buried in this story. I don't want to repeat what you said. I agree with it. I think I'm going to give three quick examples because they cover the terrain. In Britain right now, there's a big to-do because a crypto company that has hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crypto investments in it has disappeared, and disappeared as of, I think, 3 or 4 months ago, and nobody can find it or the man who ran it. Nor can the people whose money is tied up in it locate him. The website's gone. The address is empty. It's the magic of a situation in which we had a minimally regulated new capitalist industry, namely crypto. And what we're getting now are calls to regulate crypto because of the scam that emerged from it. Now, a second example, the railroad in East Palestine, a perfect example. We've had railroad accidents throughout American history. They have been horrible, many of them, and they called, logically, for something to be done by the suffering people, as in East Palestine, Ohio now. And the call goes out for regulation. But the minute you look into the regulation, because we have regulated railroads for well over a century and a half since we've had them, regularly what happens is that the railroads capture the regulators. There's even a phrase in economics called regulatory capture because it's such a common experience. The profit drive that is capitalism invites and enables the corruption in the first place. You make more profit if you don't spend money on safety. You make more profit if you don't run your crypto business with the maximum transparency, filing all the documents, hiring the people to answer questions. You save a lot of money, you make more profits. And then when the regulation comes, nothing has really changed. Now you have a new cost to manipulate the regulator so that you can maximize your profit. And the third example is one that is being played out in a place you might not recognize, namely in Uber and Lyft. Let's remember, taxis are an old business. As soon as you have conveyances, whether they be horse-drawn or automobile or anything else, capitalists arrive, people who want to invest in the business, they buy the cars or the buggies or whatever it is to move us around in taxi rides, and now they want to maximize their profit. And pretty soon that means economizing on upkeep of the vehicle, on vetting the vehicle driver, and pretty soon you have the accidents and the breakdowns and the atrocities. And then it turns out that the company economized on insurance, so you can't collect. And guess what? We regulate the taxis, as we do everywhere in this country, with a taxi regulatory commission. And then what happens? Well, the same thing that happened with the East Palestine Railroad. The taxi companies capture the commission, and then the commission looks the other way, relaxes the rules, accommodates exceptions, all the usual loophole arrangements that we've come to expect. And here's the conclusion I draw. We are wasting our time having these sterile debates about more or less regulation. Neither the absence of regulations nor the presence of regulatory bodies has solved the problem. Every industry is constantly plagued with the same scenario. What I've just said about taxis or railroad transport or crypto could be said, as everyone listening or watching us knows, about every other industry. It's only a question of where in the absurd cycling we're standing. Early in regulation, medium through, regulation undone, then the explosive bad results. So we renew the regulation to have it captured again. I mean, here's the problem. We have a system that has a contradiction. And it can't solve the problem with regulation, but it doesn't want to face what it might mean to be unable to solve that problem. And I'll tell you what it means. It means that you got to change the system because it isn't working. And the solutions you find to the problems it keeps posing don't work. It's a little bit like taking masses of people, as we do in this country, incarcerating them and discovering that doing that solves nothing. It simply makes those you throw into the jails come out probably in worse psychological shape than they went in, given all the circumstances. And you're just not solving the problem, but you refuse to face it. So all you do is incarcerate ever more people and keep wondering why we still have absurd crime rates, absurd murder, gun, all the rest of it, because this solution of incarceration, it doesn't work.
So, in one sense, metaphorically, you're kind of describing, having a mountain lion as a house pet. You bring the mountain lion in and you put it on a leash and chews through the leash and hurts somebody and it runs away. You get another mountain lion. It keeps happening. It's like, get a dog already. I mean, it's like, a mountain lion is not a good house pet. Is that a fair analogy?
Absolutely. At a certain point, you have to overcome your understandable admiration that the lion had some good qualities. Capitalism has some good qualities, but it also has unspeakable flaws and faults. And I say literally unspeakable because we live in a society that wishes to deny them. And as a result, keep suffering just as the family would that kept buying yet another new mountain lion because it hadn't understood that this is a pet who doesn't work in a household the way a dog, a cat, or many other things would and could, and we know all about that. You cannot have a system that makes, quote, profit the bottom line, which means profit is the priority, profit is the point, and then be surprised when all the consequences of that kind of a system impose themselves on you. You have to then ask the system question, but that's a taboo in this country, so we're stuck with this absurd, and I have it bad as an economics professor, because in most of my colleagues' disputes, that's the issue. That's the so-called great debate. Should the government regulate or not? Should we have a free market or should we have a market with regulate? And we have endless studies and endless conferences and endless debates without someone finally standing up and saying, this is the modern equivalent of something we mock. And I don't even know if it's real, but I remember my professors telling me of cases in the Middle Ages in Europe when very erudite gentlemen debated the question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Because angels have no dimensions. The head of the pin is minuscule. And they had conferences to debate this question. We think it's crazy because from our perspective, it's a non-issue. Well, I think in the future, we're going to be seeing people amazed that the 20th and 21st centuries had all these otherwise perfectly sane and rational human beings discussing something they should have outgrown long ago.
So, I also I often think in reading about what's going on in the economy of that by now cliched story of the scorpion too, riding on the back of whatever it is, a beaver or whatever the hell, and stinging it. It's his nature, right? It's my nature. That's what he says as they both go, in other words, you're saying, but it's their nature. What do you expect? And I guess, you mentioned your colleagues, and I was thinking as you were speaking about this, that you're really placing yourself in opposition, as I understand it, to not only, conservative economics, as it's normally described, the Milton Friedman school or what have you, of the quote unquote free market, don't regulate, but the more liberal school of John Maynard Keynes and so on, who are ascendant in one form or neo-Keynesian or classic Keynesian, but are ascendant in one form or another, let's say, in many parts of the Democratic Party, that say a school that says, well, capitalism unrestrained will be harmful, so we need to restrain it. But also inherent in that assumption is that the restraint is possible, right?
Right. There's this assumption that somehow the profit maximizing capitalists, whom they celebrate left, right, and center, certainly the Milton Friedmans of this world or the James Buchanan or any of that school, they somehow want us to believe that the profit maximizing capitalists, when confronted with a regulation or a regulatory body, will somehow realize the error of his maximization program and not maximize anymore, accept the regulation, when we have endless evidence that the regulation is just one more cost of business to be treated like every other cost. The labor cost, the input cost, all the other costs of business. The job of the capitalist is to figure out how to, get ready, reduce the cost, make the workers work faster, make them work longer hours, find a cheaper source of your input. Well, if you're constantly getting around every other obstacle or problem to profit maximization, why would you imagine that the line would stop at the regulatory body? So, of course, every regulated industry, and let me underscore this, every regulated industry in the United States maintains lobbyists lobbyists in Washington and lobbyists at most, if not all, state capitals and in many city halls as well. You know what their job is? To work around the regulators and the regulations, to get them rewritten, to get them softened, to get them eliminated, to throw the election to the people who will regulate you least. And in the process, donations get made, relationships get created. I mean, it's so boringly obvious that it's only in a university setting whose function is to rationalize a system rather than analyze it, that we could go on pretending, as you're right, the liberals in the Democratic Party never tire of doing. Number one, deny that capitalism has a flaw. If that becomes impossible, retreat to plan B. Okay, it has a flaw, but we're going to fix it with a law or a regulation. This is ridiculous. It is so full of holes that the only thing that's remarkable is that it still is alive, and it's testimony to how deep the taboo against questioning the system, which would be the rational way to take it, as your example shows, to stop thinking you're going to find the one lion that doesn't do what lions do. Instead of it, go get a dog. It's the easier, obvious solution if you're not blind in your attachment to the lion.
So, first of all, you better be careful. You can make a radical out of me if you keep talking. But more to the, a couple things I wanted to explore a little bit. Like many people, I've long said that traditional or mainstream economics, as it's been practiced for the last and preached for the last 50 years, is a kind of theology, right? It's belief in a God that is not only unproven, that not only calls for agnosticism, but has been disproven by empirical evidence time and time again. So I get that it's not only a faith, but it's a blind faith. But what you're saying, as I, process it, is the other school of thought that prevailed before that also leans heavily on faith. Because, the idea that you can regulate this system it's almost, I think you're saying because it's predicated on something that's not in human nature, which is that, that people, when they're, they think a regulatory system will manage itself, and almost that it exists outside of individual incentives. That, Senator Elizabeth Warren famously said personnel is policy, but, and that's the liberal position, right? That's standard liberal economic position. Personnel is policy. But I suppose you're raising the question that I'd never really thought about. Well, why is personnel policy? Because if personnel is policy, then when the personnel changes, the policy changes. So that kind of, you don't have a democracy anymore. You have something else. And you described in detail the lobbying and those types of things. But I think what you're saying is that and correct me if I'm wrong, the liberal theology is also, faith-based rather than evidence-based. And, faith is fine outside the public sphere, but it's time to look at the record. I mean, I'm not putting it beautifully, but, hopefully, am I on the right track?
I think so, although I would be careful. I admit, and I think that everybody I've ever met has in them both a certain commitment to look at the reality around them without rose-colored glasses, but a human failing, which is it often feels really good to slip those rose-colored glasses right back on. In other words, we are a mixture of the faith and the science or whatever, however you want to calculate it. And so I think it's fairer to say, look, we all have some faith and we all try to look at the world the way it is and not let the faith blind us. And we're imperfect in achieving that objective. So let's not call each other the names. You're faithful. I'm factual. But let's do what you say, which is let's be honest. Let's take a look at what we know is going on. Let's see if we can agree on what the facts are that are relevant, and then let's compare how it's working for our faithful sides. Let's do that. And I think in order to do that, you have to be free enough of the system in which you function to at least allow for the space for those who think the system is the problem. And what we have to face in America, which is not yet achieved, to say the least, is we have to stop demonizing that alternative. We have to admit that it's useful to have people who are questioning the system, that it's not a sign that you're disloyal, it's not a sign that you work for Mr. Putin or any of the other demonizing mechanisms that this society is so adept at doing. Stop it. It was a horrible legacy of the Cold War that made everybody critical of capitalism be ipso facto the enemy of us, and we're paying the price now. We are caught in this example, in this endless debate about more or less regulation. The conservatives are right to make fun of deregulation because of its failures. The liberals are right to suggest that if you didn't regulate, things would be probably even worse than they already are. They're both right, and we ought to understand what it might mean, just as an exercise, if both sides of these debates are continuously correct. Because if you don't have to be a Hegelian to understand, if people arguing exact opposites are both correct, you got a bigger problem than is within the frame of what you're arguing about. I mean, you ought to be able to admit that as a possibility, but instead we don't. So it requires a few folks like me willing and able to step outside the consensus and mock those people trapped within it, because they're not getting anywhere. We are still the most violent country in the world. We incarcerate more people. That's why I use that example. It doesn't work, this endless production of prisons. It doesn't help most of the people that go in there. It makes them more difficult to participate in society, as they'll tell you and as their families will tell you over and over. Stop. We can't stop. Because if we do, we have to ask the questions about the system that is still a taboo. It frightens people. And the guardians of the absolute priority of the system, they are ready to pounce at anyone who moves a step beyond the acceptable level of discourse. And you know what that is a sign of more than anything else? The end of an empire.
Yeah.
And it ought to scare the pants off people who disagree with me substantively about everything, but they must somewhere understand. You must be a terrified people if you can't ask questions about whole logical parts of the environment you depend on. You're blinding yourself, and you're going to stumble badly because of it.
I think somewhere I wrote about a certain kind of person being, those armed guards who patrol the leftward perimeter of the discourse, ready to shoot on sight. And, what you get a lot of times when, in this conversation, and obviously I want to go back to the topic, what you get a lot of times is, you're right. I mean, this is the kind of response I get. You're right. Okay. But we don't want to marginalize ourselves so much that what we say doesn't matter. But what happens then is, you talked about holding two thoughts at one time that could be correct. Can't we increase our understanding of that? And maybe at the same time, we want to, marginally improve things for people who are suffering. But why is that a conversation that's forbidden to us? And I mean, we know the answer. I ask it rhetorically. We know the answer. You just said it, which is it's a self-reinforcing system. But, Richard Wolff, I named the show as the 0 hour, right? Because I saw an interlocking, the cool term, by the way, I'm told at Davos now is polycrisis. Well, that's just, fancy way of saying a lot of crap going wrong at once, right? It's a monocrisis. There's one underlying problem. But the 0 hour, because, like a black hole, like they say in astronomy, a black hole singularity reaches a point where it begins to collapse inward on itself because the gravitational weight is too high, right? And that's the irreversible point. And I kind of feel like we're approaching irreversible points. We passed some already on the climate. As I say, all like a monocrisis. The climate, social injustice, economic inequality, the destruction of whatever democracy we've had. And it seems to me that, and I guess this is maybe the entry point into this, that maybe in the United States for a few decades, there was kind of like an uneasy quasi-stability after Roosevelt where okay, it was a crisis. We've kind of got it in control. A few people like my own uncle died because profiteers cut corners on World War II planes or whatever. But, basically we got it under control, except for the black people and except for a few people, in other words, we didn't, but we kind of partially did. But that the erosion, the loss of balance or whatever that led the entire system to start to really decline from maybe the 80s on was inevitable. In other words, that it's not like we can reestablish this sort of Rooseveltian, pseudo stability, the equilibrium. It's all that was an artifact of a particular place and time, but that will never be a permanent solution. Very diffused way of saying what I'm trying to say, but do you get what my question is? Which is, there will be a school of thought that says we can go back to what we had after Roosevelt. We can go back to what we had in the 60s, but with more racial justice and so on. But I suppose would be one counter argument to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that I have no illusion that what I said will penetrate the minds of those that are committed to the free market fantasy utopianism of a Milton Friedman. That's what they have to believe. It's their mantra. They've built their lives around it. I understand that. I have people like that in my family, so I know that. And I know there are the other kind who are absolutely convinced that one or another regulation or this new law will somehow fix the system so it gets at least to that passable quality you just described. And I feel that all I can do is hope that there are enough people who have noticed, as I have, the pendulum swinging back and forth between more and less regulation, more and less reform, and begin there, but because they see it and are willing to think about it, therefore stumble on people like me who say, hey, there is another way to approach this. And I don't mean to be frightening people, but, we are now arguably closer to the actual deployment by one side or another or both of nuclear weapons than we ever were in the Cold War itself, even including that one little episode with the missiles that were going to be stationed, not shot, stationed in Cuba with Kennedy and Khrushchev and all of that. But here we are with our leaders talking about it in an ongoing kind of way. And we have converted, as we need as a country to do, an adversary who's not part of the Communist Party, never was, has nothing to do with any of that, disdains it whenever he talks about it, which isn't much. But we've converted him into another Stalin. It's perfectly appropriate, just as the leader in Iraq was another Stalin, and and it doesn't work. Afghanistan is now run by the Taliban. We were there for many, many years. And it didn't work. And it didn't work in Iraq either. And it isn't going to work in Ukraine. It's not what's going on there. These apocalyptic, good versus bad, God versus the devil. This way of thinking that there's no alternative to the either ors you're trapped in, it's personally destructive and socially cataclysmic in what it makes possible. And so that at a certain point, I actually do think that the taboo will disappear, probably much quicker than we imagined, because we assumed it was deeply rooted when it really wasn't so deeply rooted. It was just so habitual that it took something to shake it, but once you did, it's a little bit like the rest of the world has come to understand these bizarre polls, something you and I should talk about. The polls, Gallup and the others who poll young people in America, and discover that a majority of them say they prefer socialism to capitalism. How is that possible after 75 years of relentless anti-socialist propaganda at every level of American society? It turns out that those commitments people had don't run anywhere near as deep as we thought they must. And that's an opening that we have that makes me a bit hopeful that those of us outside the entrapment of the things too scary to think other than may have a better audience around us than we have understood.
And, of course, the profit motive is a through line in that, too, in the nuclear brinksmanship. I mean, a general works for the Pentagon his whole life, retires, gets on the board of Raytheon, goes on MSNBC and gets fawned over by Lawrence O'Donnell or Rachel Maddow and people, So, of course, I guess just a couple closing comments. One is, and by the way, the Pentagon proudly announced that it did better in its latest audit than it had in previous years, because they were able to account for 60% of the funds of the approximately $1 trillion a year, whatever the Pentagon spends. 40%, they don't know. And I'll close with this. The system is so deranged that we have the president and senior Defense Department officials saying, the likelihood of the probability of nuclear conflict is low. Do you want a pilot to come on the broadcast system on your airliner and say the probability of crashing is pretty low? I think we got a good shot here. That's no. So I'll close with that. But I assume you agree that there's a through line here, and that the through line is this runaway profit line. I know it sounds simplistic, but I actually believe it.
Absolutely. I see it everywhere. It isn't simplistic. It's a very sophisticated system. It's a very complicated system. But like all sophisticated and complicated systems, if you work at it and if you're committed to communicating to other people, you can reduce it down to simple relationships that everybody can understand and discuss and make good decisions around. People who tell you it's too complicated are hiding something, and that they ought to be caught up about that rather than they'll be allowed to get away. It's just another assertion that a few of us know what's going on and the rest of you should bow out.
Yeah, I guess in closing, next time someone tells you it's too complicated, say, try me. You might be surprised. All right, Richard Wolff, as always, a great pleasure talking with you and very informative. So as always, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ. And I look forward to it. These are really wonderful conversations.
I do too. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.